I'm happy to welcome Professor James Forman Jr. to give this year's Clear Distinguished lecture. Each year, the Center on Law, Equality, and Race invites two lectures from people whose work fits within the mission of CLEAR, which is to promote greater racial equalities through research, education, and advocacy. And before Professor Forman gets started, let me offer a little bit of background. Professor Forman graduated from Brown and then went to Yale Law School. After law school, Professor Forman clerked for Judge William Norris of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and then Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. From there, he joined the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C., where he spent 6 years defending both juveniles and adults. After that, he worked for along with David Domenici, started the Maya Angelou Public Charter School, an alternative school for high school dropouts and youth who had previously been arrested. A decade later, in 2007, the Maya Angelou School expanded and agreed to run the school inside DC's juvenile prison. The effort has garnered wide acclaim. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to the 60 Minutes archives and see the feature they did on it, including an interview with Professor Forman. Professor Forman taught at Georgetown Law School from 2003 to 2011. Since 2011, he has been a professor at Yale Law School, where he teaches courses in constitutional law, juvenile law, and education law and policy. He has widely published, both in academic journals and in the popular press, and has fearlessly taken on issues that scare away others: youth in the criminal justice system, violent offenders, and complicity of black leaders in the rise of mass incarceration, which we'll hear more about today. The book that Professor Forman will be discussing today, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America, has been longlisted for the 2017 National Book Award. Stay tuned, the shortlist comes out next week. So please help me in welcoming Professor James.
Thank you, Karin, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank all of you for coming out. Thank you for inviting me. Mario, Rabi, thank you for going across Orange County. And
reveal these things.
and it's a special pleasure to be here with some old friends and colleagues. Carrie Menkel-Metal helped to welcome me into academia, was somebody who was always there to talk to me about scholarship and also about teaching, and I honor that and I treasure that. And I'm very proud of our faculty right now. I don't know if you happen to see this, you probably did, but Attorney General Sessions recently spoke at the law school, and there was a wonderful picture of a number of members of the Georgetown faculty taking a knee outside his talk. This is a gentleman who came to give a talk about the sort of snowflakes and hypersensitivity of people to free speech. Meanwhile, his Department of Justice is prosecuting right now protesters who protested and disrupted a hearing, a Senate hearing, and the irony appears to be entirely lost on our Attorney General, but was not lost on the members of the Georgetown faculty. And Bob Solomon, Carrie welcomed me to Georgetown, and Bob welcomed me to Yale. Although I'm noticing a trend here, they welcome me and then they left. So I'm gonna say that that's about how wonderful Irvine is. That these giants of legal education chose to leave places where they had built really kind of towering careers to join y'all. Bob, I want to say two things about Bob just to make sure that everybody knows this. I think you will, but if you don't, I want to make sure you do. So Bob dressed like that at Yale. This is not a California thing. This is how he rolls. And today, of all days, I'm so pleased. Somebody pointed this out to me. I don't know. Yeah. Bob picked a shirt that is matching the book cover. Right? His brother is on point. Thank you. Thank you.
Buy the shirt.
While Rabi was getting books, you were getting matching shirts. I'm gonna quick mention. I'll be back. If you know anybody in the LA area, I'm gonna be back on November 29th. There's a talk that's sponsored by the LA Public Library. There's a series called the Allowed series, and I'm gonna be speaking there November 29th in conversation with Professor Robin D.G. Kelly from UCLA, and I think it's going to be a really fun night. And it'll be different from today because it'll be a conversation as opposed to a talk. And I have no idea what Professor Kelly is going to come up with, but I've heard that he is a great and provocative conversation partner. So you can find details. My website, jamesformanjr.com, has an upcoming events link, and you can find that if you encourage friends that are a little bit north of here to check that out. So I thought I'd start by talking about my motivations for writing this book. And my first motivation has nothing to do with the criminal system whatsoever. I don't know if there's anybody else out here who is like this, but for me, I'm the kind of person who, if I go to a film and there's no African American characters in it, then later somebody says, "What did you think of the film?" And my first reaction is always, where were the black characters? Where were the black people presented in this story? And I feel that way about movies, about television. I feel that about history. I feel that way about law. And so I knew when I wrote my first book, I knew that I wanted to write a book that had African-American characters front and central in the narrative. Not a sideshow, not like the best friend that gets killed at the end of the first act, but really central to the story. And the other motivation came directly from my experience in the criminal system. So there are a lot of stories in this book. One of them, and I know some of y'all have had a chance to read the book, one of the stories in the book is of a young man that I represented named Brandon. And Brandon had pled guilty and was facing sentencing for possession of a gun and a small amount of marijuana, $15, $20 worth. And I was a public defender that had been appointed to represent him. And I had taken the job because I viewed it as the civil rights work of my generation. My parents met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I have a button, the SNCC button that I wear on my jacket to honor their contributions. And they were an interracial couple. My dad's African American, my mom's white. They're an interracial couple at a time when those marriages were illegal in many states in this country. We just had the 50th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia. And their generation changed America, right? Theirs was the generation that faced down Bull Connor's dogs, that marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that went to D.C. 250,000 strong for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And they made it possible, their sacrifice, their struggle, made it possible for somebody like me to be living a life that was not imaginable to a black man of my father's generation, clerking on the Supreme Court, working as a public defender in D.C. And at the same time, it was also clear to me how much work was left to be done in the civil rights movement. And it seemed to me, in law school, sitting where, a lot of y'all are, now, the students are sitting, it seemed to me in the mid-1990s that the criminal justice system was the place where so much of that accumulated disadvantage that had not been remedied by the civil rights movement was playing itself out and manifesting itself. We didn't have this, how how old I am for the students, we didn't have the term mass incarceration when I became a public defender. That was a term that was created in the year 2000. But we already knew by the mid-90s that we knew from the Sentencing Project that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. And that same report, although it got less attention, that same report also reported that black women were the largest single growing part of the prison system. We already knew that the United States had passed Russia and South Africa to become the world's largest jailer. We already, in the mid-90s, had 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. And I had seen this in my own life in some ways. I grew up in a working class, lower middle class, mostly African American neighborhood in Atlanta. And when I was a kid, there were 2 huge buildings in 2 blocks from my home. One was the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and the other was a GM plant. By the time I graduated law school 20 years later, one of those buildings had shut down, and the other one had built an addition. And you know which is which. So that drove me to become a public defender. It drove me to be standing next to Brandon in court. And I was asking for him to get probation. I had a letter from a teacher and a counselor at his school. It was his first arrest. Those letters attested to his character. His mother and grandmother were sitting there in court with me. The courtroom in DC, the courtrooms are not too dissimilar to this. The defense table is here. The prosecution table is here. The judge sits there. And in the first row of the courtroom, the seats are a little bit further back than this whiteboard, was Brandon's mother and his grandmother, and they had been there for every court hearing. They wanted him home. The prosecutor in the case was asking for him to be locked up. She wanted him to go to Oak Hill, which was the name for DC's juvenile facility. The real name should have been a dungeon, because that's what it was. No functioning school, no job training program. Some things on paper, if you looked on the website, or I don't even know if they had a website then, but if you went down to the mayor's office and asked, they'd give you some programs, but they actually, when you went to the place, you didn't see any of that. What you saw was violence, what you saw was drugs, what you saw was a place where people always left worse off than when they entered. The judge had to make the decision, Judge Curtis Walker, and I should say, I changed the names of my clients and all, but not just that, I changed the names of all the actors, the lawyers, the judges, not to protect the privacy of the judges, I don't care about their privacy, but I didn't want anybody to even be able to reason back from the name of a judge or the name of a prosecutor somehow to figure out who any of the clients were. So I wanted to protect my clients' privacy in that way, and Judge Walker, not his real name, looks out in the courtroom and he sees Brandon facing sentencing. That's not unusual if you go to DC court. If you go to DC court and look at who's tried, you would think there were no white people in DC, or that if there are, they don't commit crimes, and neither of those things is true. And then there's an African-American defense lawyer, me, black prosecutor, and the judge himself is African-American. Not unusual, 40% of the judges in DC are African-American. He looks at Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Forman's been telling me that you deserve a second chance, that you deserve a tough life, that you have had a tough life. Well, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow segregation. Judge had been a child in those years, and he tells Brandon what that was like. And then he wraps up and he says, so here's the thing, son. People fought. People marched, people died for you to be free. Dr. King died for your freedom. And I'll tell you this, he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. That was not his dream at all. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you do turn it around. But right now, today, actions have consequences. Your consequences will kill. He locked him up. And I was so angry at the judge that day. You know, he had taken the same history that motivated me to become a public defender and flipped it around as a justification for locking up my client. But as I reflected on it more and more, I started thinking about the fact that, the judge wasn't alone. I mentioned that 40% of the judges in the city are African American. The police force in D.C. was and is majority black. The police chief was black. The city council that passed the gun laws and the drug laws that Brandon was being sentenced under was a majority African American city council. The mayor was black. The chief prosecutor in the city was Eric Holder. And with all of that representation, it was still true. I told you 1 in 3 young African-American men was under criminal justice supervision nationally. In D.C., it was 1 in 2. And so it started to come to me that somebody needed to tell this story of how over the last 50 years, as this country embarked on a punitive experiment, the likes of which the world had never seen, how it was that so many in my own community came along for the ride, ended up thinking that some of those policies made sense. And I knew in writing that story that were 2 things that I had to remember. One, I had to write from a stance of empathy, a stance of compassion. I had to, as upset as I was at the judge that day, if I was going to sit down and write the book, I actually had to try to figure out the motives and the motivations and the backgrounds of the people that were making decisions that I thought were wrong, that I thought were mistakes. And the other thing that I knew I had to do is I had to avoid what I think of as the Fox News problem, which is to say, I had to write this story, I had to tell this history in such a way that was not susceptible to being co-opted or misused by Fox News or similar outlets. That is to say, I had to write the story while at this same time emphasizing that the African American actors and officials and activists that I'm writing about were operating in a system of constraint. They were operating in a larger structure of racism and discrimination and structural barriers. So they didn't have all the options on the table that they would have liked. So those are the challenges. Now, because a number of you I know have, because of Rabi's efforts, gotten copies of this book. So we could stop now and do, my son is 8, they do sustained silent reading in his class. We could stop and do sustained silent reading and you could get the answer to the puzzle. But since y'all are busy, I'll give you the highlights of the argument. Well, the first thing that's important to remember in figuring out how we got here is rising crime and violence in black communities throughout this 50-year period, but especially in the 1980s, the crack years, and the 1960s, the heroin years. My students, when I talk to my students now, they may know about the crack era through media representations, through The Wire or otherwise, but the heroin in the 60s is largely forgotten. So in the 1960s, the murder rate in this country doubled. In DC, it tripled. In LA, it more than doubled. In Oakland, it more than doubled. And at the same time, in that decade, heroin took a devastating toll on black communities nationwide. In DC, they test everybody entering the DC jail for drugs. And in 1963, they concluded that 4% of the population entering the jail was heroin addicts. By 1969, that 4% had become 45%. Now, that's an epidemic. And it wasn't just the numbers, but it was also the fear and the anguish that they created in the community. So to write the book, one of the things I did is I went to archival sources. A lot of the African-American elected officials in D.C. have donated their papers to various libraries in the city. None of these are scanned. There's no keyword searches, I'm sorry to report. This is manila folder after manila folder. You open it up, you take out, and you look, and you see what you see. And if you do that for multiple summers in D.C., you will uncover a treasure trove of direct reports from citizens about how they are feeling. These are written in the 70s mostly African American citizens, 70% cities, 70% black at this time. Written to mostly African American elected officials. 11 out of the 13 original city council members in 1975 are African American. And the letters say things like, I don't know what's happened to us as a community. I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my streets. I can't go outside. I can't take my kid to school because they're selling drugs on the corner. I don't want him to see that, and it's not safe. And I can't leave him in the park after school because they're shooting. And there's needles. And over again, the letters end with some version of, do something, do something. You have to do something about this. Now, who's receiving these letters? That's the second big argument in the book. The group that's receiving these letters, the generation that's receiving these letters, is the first generation of black elected officials to come into office in this country's history after Reconstruction. 1970s, there's an 800% increase. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, there's an 800% increase nationwide in black elected officials. This is a generation, many of them are from the South, some of them were in the Civil Rights Movement. All of them remember the long history of under-enforcement and under-protection of the law in black communities. They remember, my dad used to tell me this, and then when I started doing the research, I saw it. He used to say, we didn't call, he grew up in Mississippi, Chicago, we didn't call the police when there was a problem. The police weren't gonna come to a black neighborhood, and if they did, they were guaranteed to make matters worse. This generation remembers Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan, asked about homicide, black community, they said, that's not a homicide. That's another dead black person. And trust me, they did not use the words black person. So they know this history, they're formed and shaped by this history. Now they're in office, and they're bound and determined to respond to those letter writers who wouldn't have even bothered to write the letter under Jim Crow because they would have known that they weren't going to get a response. Okay. So crime is rising, violence, the officials are motivated to respond, but why police? Why prosecutors? Why is that how they respond? And that gets to the third argument in the book. I said that I was writing about African American elected officials. But as I said up front when I referred to the Fox News problem, any story that's about black elected officials is also going to be a story about the larger structures that constrain and limit their ability to operate. So let me talk about what some of those institutional forces are. The first one is historical. These officials have been elected to represent communities that, because of a history of discrimination, right, starting in slavery, but not just that, going forward into the 20th century, redlining, black families can't get loans to improve their homes, which generates a wealth gap. Usurious lenders who go into black neighborhoods and take advantage of people's financial distress and then foreclose on their homes. The federal government highway urban renewal policy in the 1950s and 1960s and highway placement problem in the 1950s and 1960s. I don't know if anybody is, I don't know where people are from, but in almost any city, you can find a highway that was put through a thriving black community. In my city of Atlanta, it was Auburn Avenue. We used to call it Black Wall Street. Put I-75, I-85 right through the middle of it, and the neighborhood never recovered. In LA, it's the 10. 10 wasn't supposed to first go there, but community pressure from more affluent neighborhoods pushed it to where it was built, and it ended up destroying or negatively impacting black neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So the communities that these officials have been elected to represent have been denied the resources to protect themselves. The second constraint is a political one. So this is a story about local elected officials, right? And and that's where black political power is concentrated. City government, county government, mayor's office, police chiefs, local prosecutors. And one of my arguments is that local government is important, underrated, understudied to figure out how we got mass incarceration and how we get out of it. But there's limits to local government, and you can see that over and over again in the book, because the people that I'm writing about, they have what I call an all-of-the-above strategy to fighting crime and violence, right? They want more police and more prosecutors. Some of them even want more prisons. But they also want more money for housing, more money for schools, more money for job programs, more money for mental health programs. They want the federal government to fight segregation and discrimination. They want national gun control. They're passing local gun control laws in Atlanta, in DC, in Chicago, in New York, but they want national gun control laws. They want the federal government to pass a Marshall Plan for urban America. They want the United States government to do for black communities what it did for Europe after World War II, to rebuild, to revitalize, to reinvest. They have this all of the above strategy, but they go to Congress and they get one of the above. And the one of the above that they get is money for law enforcement. There's one more constraint that I want to mention. And this is a constraint that I think we still suffer from, many of us, all of us to an extent, to greater or less extent, suffer from today. And this is constraint of imagination. So there are a lot of examples of this in the book, but I want to focus on one. One of the people that I write about is a guy named David Clark. David Clark carries smiling because he's a well-known figure in D.C. David Clark, so in 1975, D.C. gets locally elected city council. I said 11 out of 13 members are African-American, one of those 11 being Marion Barry, who later become mayor. David Clark is one of the 2 white guys elected to this first council. He has an unusual biography for a white guy. He went to Howard Law School, and he worked for Martin Luther King, Poor People's Movement, becomes a lawyer for the poor in the early 70s, and then runs for council in 1974. And he wins. David Clark is not a drug warrior. In fact, one of the first things he does is he pushes for marijuana decriminalization. That's the subject of chapter 1 of the book. He tries to decriminalize marijuana. Actually, the opposition to it is principally led by a coalition of black ministers and a black nationalist city council member who thinks drugs are a trick of the oppressor. We could talk about that, but the point is, David Clark was not a drug warrior. So now it's 5-6 years later, early 80s, heroin had gone into remission, has come back. And again, the letters are coming forward to the city council saying, and I don't endorse this language, but people are writing saying, there's a junkie nodding off on my stoop. They're on the corner, they're gathering in the alley. And again, do something. You've got to do something. Now Clark, responsible elected official, takes these letters and he forwards them to the head of the relevant government agency. He then gets a letter back. Councilmember Clark, we received your constituent complaint. We're on the case. Clark then takes both those letters and he sends them back to the citizen who first complained. That's pretty good. I don't know about y'all. I don't get like that kind of service from mine. I get auto reply. But Clark, even though he's not a drug warrior, he is an American, and he's constrained by his imagination. Who does he send the letters to? Department of Mental Health? Addiction Services? Police chief. Yeah. Would otherwise, Attorney General would have been that good guess. He sends them to the police department. Because in this country, we've come to believe, reflexively almost, unthinkingly, that problem of an addict in public space, police problem, law enforcement. Not social work, not mental health, not public health. So, that's the argument of the book in broad strokes. There's other, there's some stuff on class. There's stuff on the rise of black police officers and why that hasn't made as much of a difference in changing police behavior as people originally hoped that it would. There's other stuff we can talk about maybe in conversation. But I want to spend the last few minutes shifting from the discussion of how we got here to a discussion of what we can do about it, how we get out, how we turn the corner. And so the first thing I guess that I want to say about that is I guess an overall perspective to have on the issue that I think grows out of this book, which is it's easy to think of this problem of mass incarceration, 2.3 million people, 2.2 million people in prison, 7 million under criminal justice supervision. We don't even know how many million have lost the right to vote and participate in society because they're out in the world with criminal convictions. We don't even have good records about some of that. And it seems like the kind of thing that you can trace to a particular legislative action or a presidency or an executive action. But the truth is, I argue that that's not how it was created. Instead, it was over a 50-year period across 50 states and DC and the federal government, 3,000 counties. A lot of these decisions are made at the county level. So y'all know living here. If everybody becomes somewhat more punitive, somewhat more harsh, 5, 15, 20%, then nobody individually has to radically change their behavior. If everybody changes their behavior somewhat over a 50-year period, it creates this assembly line mechanism that keeps speeding up and speeding up and speeding up and leads to the human rights crisis that we have today. And I think it's going to have to be unwound the same way. There isn't going to be a particular moment, a particular piece of legislation. It really is going to be thousands of tiny steps. And all of us collectively are going to have to take some of those steps. The other thing that I want to say as like a framing is, and I think y'all know this better maybe than maybe some folks in other parts of the state. I spent a year in Berkeley, and they're a little bit they don't quite understand what I'm about to say, but I think y'all will. But this isn't a problem that we can ascribe to like the Trump states. This isn't a problem. There's no liberal bubbles on this issue. You know, I was one of my neighbors in Berkeley this past year. I remember after the election, he was really upset about the election results, and I started talking to him about state government, and I was like, yes, it's bad, but like on my issues, criminal justice and education, they're really state and local issues. So I started talking about all the stuff that you can do at the state level and block out some of the noise of DC to the best you can and keep working. And his response was, yeah, you know, if I lived in one of the Trump states, like if I lived in Oklahoma or Arkansas or Alabama, then I could work on those issues, but I live in the liberal bubble of California, and y'all are shaking your heads because you're down here and you know what's up. But I was like, no. I was like, your state led the prison building movement in the 80s and 90s, and I had just a couple days before that conversation, I had been in San Quentin. Across the water from both Berkeley and San Francisco, this beautiful spot, one of California's oldest prisons, and I had spoken to a bunch of lifers. Many of them were there on the 3-strike stuff. Some of them were there on serious violent offenders, but they were still 40, 50 years into the sentence. It was like a nursing home in there. And I said, they're there because of what y'all did. And that's California voters. That's not Trump and Sessions. And he like walked away muttering. So it's not a they problem. It's not a them problem. It's an us problem. It's a we problem. And you see that focusing on black elected officials allows you an insight into that. But the point is a broader one, right? The point is how it's all of us, right? Because if the folks that I'm writing about could end up making some of these choices, that's evidence that we all have, either actively or in some cases silently, complicitly allowing our tax dollars to be used. All right, so more concretely, just a couple thoughts on the policy, and because I'm here, I have to mention prosecutors. prosecutors are the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system. You're in a state that is in the midst of, or you're in a county that's in the midst of a major, major crisis over the behavior of its prosecutors. But even the things that they're talking about are just like, that's just skimming the surface of what's wrong with the choices and the decisions that the prosecutors in this county have been making. But what I want to say about prosecutors is they didn't get handed down from God, they're elected. And a lot of progressives have sort of avoided thinking about prosecutor races when we think about local elections. But I want to say we can't do that. If we care about equality and race and law, we have to focus on local prosecutors' races. And I know that this isn't the most, I brought this up in the hallway beforehand, and one of my friends said, well, that it's going to take a while to shift and change the attitudes in this county. But I wouldn't be so cautious, and I would encourage folks that are thinking about this issue to really start thinking about who can you groom and who can you get behind that could run to be a more progressive-minded prosecutor in this county. Because let me tell you, last November, in the same election that produced our current president, that was also an election that for the first time in my lifetime, many, many progressive prosecutors ran for office, and they ran on campaigns of, my predecessor was corrupt and is under indictment and was misusing the office, like stuff that you're talking about here right now. My predecessor locked up too many people, wrongful convictions. The war on drugs has been a disaster. We need bail reform, right? And they won. They won on these campaigns in Florida, in Alabama, in Denver, in Chicago, in Texas. A guy in Texas who spent his life as a defense attorney who has the words "not guilty" tattooed on his chest ran for prosecutor and won, y'all, in Texas. In Philadelphia, I know, right? I'm like, I thought I was hardcore, but I'm not getting that. I'm not tattooed. In Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, a guy who his career has been, like the lead thing on his CV is suing cops for police misconduct, decided that he was going to run for prosecutor. Now, Philadelphia has had prosecutors black and white, but they've all been tough on crime for 40 years. And people laughed when he said he was going to run. This is 5 months ago. But activists, including from Black Lives Matter and other local community folks, said, you know what? We got to get involved in this. We're going to support this candidate. We're going to knock on doors. And he won the Democratic primary going away. And the general election is coming up soon. It's a Democratic city. He's expected to win. But if we're going to change how criminal justice operates in the places we live, we've got to get involved in these prosecutor races. The other thing that I want to say is brief just mention of course, public defenders. This book, in a lot of ways, is a love letter to public defenders. I was on a panel in Baltimore, and this federal judge, Andre Davis, said, what I liked about this book was you were critical of everybody, but you were fair to everybody. And when he finished talking, I thought, that's actually not true. Because there's one group of people that I'm not critical of. There's one group of people that are like the heroes of this book. And it's not coincidentally my role, which I really didn't think about. Like, it wasn't conscious, but there you go, like the bias playing itself out that you don't even recognize. But 2% of the money that we spend in the criminal system in this country goes to public defenders. 2%. And so you have public defenders that have caseloads of 250, 300. That there's no way they can perform the way my colleagues and I were performing in this book because we were in an office that was adequately funded. That's another decision. That's a state, county, and local decision. How much money you spend on public defenders is a state, county, and local decision. Let me just move off of policy just for a second to talk on a more personal level, because one of the things I think when we think about these issues, we have to fight on the policy level, but we also have to look at what are our own spheres of influence, right? What are our own domains of control? What are the places where, even if the world is being unfair, where we can make a difference? And at a university, one thing to think about is, what are your employment practices about hiring people that have criminal records? What are your admissions practices? There's I don't know the answer, but there's a wide range, and there's more and less progressive approaches on this issue, and I would encourage folks to find out what your policies are, and then try to make them as welcoming and progressive as possible. The Ford Foundation does this amazing work on criminal justice reform, and they recently had presented at a New York prison all their work. They had PowerPoints and everything, and talking about what they were doing. And one of the guys who was incarcerated, at the end of the presentation, he raised his hand and he said, "Thank you for that amazing presentation. I just have one question. When I get out, could I be hired at the Ford Foundation?" And they didn't know the answer, but to their credit, they went back, scrubbed their HR policies, got rid of about 90% of the exclusions, not all of them, but a lot of them, and they were super overbroad. As most people don't know, these HR policies sit in a file cabinet or on a computer file, and no one even has really paid attention to how overbroad they are. But they went further than that, and they set up a paid, with benefits, internship program, which with the possibility of moving into full-time position, which they aggressively market to people that have criminal records. And that's really what we have to do. That's the next stage beyond ban the box, because we've stigmatized people so thoroughly that have criminal records that people don't even think they can get jobs when they can. So we actually have to go further and let them know that they're welcome, that we will consider their application in the fullness of their humanity, their whole record, not just the crime they committed. And let me mention one other thing, since that's very personal to me, especially since I'm at a law school. I started thinking about what more I could do. I'm going around giving talks, telling people, I go to law firms, give them a long list of things they can do, and I go to police departments, I tell them what they can do. I go to prosecutors and judges, I tell them what they can do. And I started thinking about, well, what more can I do beyond going around lecturing other people on what they could do? And so I started thinking about my own teaching. I teach super privileged students. And then I got trained in a program called Inside Out. So I teach a class called Race, Class, and Punishment that I teach at the law school, the Yale Law School. But now, having been trained by Inside Out, what Inside Out does is it trains college professors, principally, and also some law professors, mostly undergraduate professors, to teach whatever is your discipline, whatever is your subject, math, art, philosophy, English, you name it, law, in a prison. But the classroom is made up of 10 men or women, if you teach in a women's prison, half people who are incarcerated and half people from your home university. And so 2 springs ago, I'm going to do it again this upcoming spring, I taught my Race, Class, and Punishment inside a Connecticut prison. 10 Connecticut guys who were incarcerated, 10 students from the law school traveled up there. And it was the most meaningful teaching I've ever done. I always tell my colleagues, don't do this for self-interested reasons, but it is the best teaching evaluations that I ever got in my time teaching. And the most meaningful evaluations came from the guys who were incarcerated. One of them wrote, he said, "I liked the law and the policy that we learned, but most of all what I liked was that when I came to class and I entered the seminar circle, I was treated like I was smart. I was treated like I had something to say. I was treated like I was an intellectual. And that hadn't happened to me before." And I don't want to minimize the structural disadvantages that separate somebody that ends up at UC Irvine from somebody who ends up being incarcerated. They're massive. But it is true that one of the things that separates you is that you and the students that I teach have been told and have been treated, even if you haven't been told explicitly, it has been suggested to you by the way you've been treated by teachers and the institutions that you are smart, that you have things to say, that you are an intellectual. Another young man wrote, "For 2 hours a week I came to this class and I could almost forget that I was in prison." Now I don't know what that's going to do over the course of their lives, but I think that experience is going to make a difference. I know it made a difference for me. And none of these things, not changing employment practices, not inside-out classes, not electing progressive prosecutors, not adequately funding public defenders' offices, none of these things by themselves is going to roll back mass incarceration, right? But collectively they will, and collectively they'll make a difference. Last thing I'm going to say about what to do, and this isn't a policy, it's just an orientation. It's a way of thinking about the world. And it comes from a conversation that I had with my dad not long before he passed. We were watching a movie about the civil rights movement. And I asked him when it was over, what did he think of the movie? This movie passed our black characters test. You'll be glad to know. And he said he liked it. He was glad that they presented that history in film because he knew a lot of people didn't read, people don't always read books, and films are important to tell people about history. He said, but there was one thing that he didn't like about it. And what he didn't like about it, he said, was they made it look like everybody was in the movement. And he said, it wasn't like that. It was unpopular at the time. He would go to college campuses and try to recruit people to join the movement, and the administrators would run them off campus. He said even the tactics that now they show in the movies and present with such valor were unpopular at the time. He said people that agreed with our end goal, ending segregation, said we agree with your goal, but we don't like your tactics. We don't like the civil disobedience. We don't like the disrupting bridges. We don't like the marches. We don't like the getting arrested. We don't like putting kids in. They show the Birmingham movement now like it's the greatest thing ever. They were vilified for putting kids in front of water hoses. I think about that a lot at this moment, right? Where people are like, well, we agree with your goal, but we don't like your tactics. Don't disrupt the anthem. The tactics are never popular in the moment. So my dad said, here's the thing. He said, change when you are facing something that is so insurmountable and apparently undefeatable. He said, people will tell you that change is impossible. He said, and then you'll march and you'll fight and you'll litigate and you'll file lawsuits that I even criticize. And you'll protest. And you'll win. You'll create the change that they said that was impossible. And then he said, the same people that told you that it was impossible are going to turn around and say, well, we knew that was inevitable. We knew that was going to happen. And then they'll make a movie about it. So I don't know, I don't know exactly what the litigation strategy is going to be. I don't know what the political strategy is going to be. I don't know what the coalition is that's going to form, but I do think it's going to be somebody, it's going to be students, it's going to be y'all that are in school here, or a group of y'all, together with other lawyers and activists around the country. But you're going to come up with the plan and the strategy and the action and the tactics that is going to help to dismantle mass incarceration and replace it with something more humane, more just, more rehabilitative, that's actually going to create safety in our communities without causing so much harm. And when you do that, and they make the movie about you, I'll be there in the front row with the popcorn. Thank you.
So I want to really just thank James for, I don't even think that was a talk. Really, I come from a long tradition of deeply religious African American women who, when you receive something that's so beneficial for your spirit, they talk about you receiving your portion. So I want to say to you in this room, thank you for sharing that with us and allowing us to receive that portion. And so at this point, we have reserved time for questions from the audience. And I almost never do this, but I'm going to do it now because I'm the moderator. And say one of the things I wanted to do is insert myself in the queue, but I'll just give it to you here because I thought about it when you were saying it. I grew up in the late 80s during the rise of the crack epidemic. And my first job post law school was as a prosecutor, and then a special assistant U.S. attorney. And I remember distinctly a moment in one of my earlier cases where there's a young black man who we prosecuted, and I gave a sort of tongue lashing to in my argument on sentencing, and he was sentenced very heavily. And I walked outside, and he was sitting there with the bailiff being ready to be transported, and he was crying. And I thought he was crying because he was about to be taken to jail, but he was really crying because of the way in which I had so horribly described him in court. And his comment to me as I walked by, another black man who was not that much older than him, was, sir, I'm not nothing. I'm not what you say I am. I'm not nothing. And because we fill prosecutors with righteous indignation for justice on behalf of the victim, I couldn't in the moment relate to that. It took me many years to understand the significance of that comment and what it meant for him to have a black prosecutor standing in front of the court with no empathy for the life experience that he led, to so harshly judge him and describe him in a space where it must have felt foreign and alien. And so I say that because that's what I did when I was a young prosecutor, because that's what I was taught to do, and that's what I believe was right. But as Carrie knows, one of our former students who had been a prosecutor in Southern California, who recently, after a number of years, has decided not to be, when I had dinner with him and I asked him about the experience of it, he quite consciously said, I understand that this is doing the man's work and not in a way in which I thought this would work. Meaning he felt the disadvantage that he was helping to perfect and to move forward in the name of a prosecutor's agenda that wasn't his own. He talked about being chastised by his superiors who said, we're a law and order organization. And so the one thing I want to ask is, because I now teach a class called Identity, Crime, and Justice, where I tell my story and tell my students, don't be like me. Don't wait until you're in your 40s to understand the way in which your actions as a young attorney can have detrimental consequences in the lives of others. And so what I am at least heartened by is, here was somebody who was in the same job I had, who now has a much different consciousness about the way in which his own actions are implicated in a system of mass incarceration. And that is a way too long buildup for the question of, are we in a better place now with how we train lawyers to understand how they are potentially implicated in locking up their own, right? This way in which, Paul Butler might have now this same kind of revelation, having been a former prosecutor and who had been prosecuted, right, about the ways in which now we see. So do you have at least the feeling that the current generation sees things that perhaps the prosecutors, when you were doing the defense work, didn't see?
Thank you for that. And have you written that? Have you written that story?
I have not. I've told that story 3 times. The other 2 times when I've taught Identity, Crime, and Justice at this school, but I've never written anything about that. I mean, I've written other things about identity and crime and justice, not just that particular.
But that's so powerful. I mean, you could take, I know you're busy and everyone always has ideas for what we should write, but this recorded, so you could take, seriously. You could like take what you say. I mean, honestly, what you like, that's 50. Like that's half the op-ed right there. And I think that's a beautiful, powerful, moving story. And I hope you think about putting it down, putting it out somewhere. So, and Paul Butler's coming here, right? It's
February.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that'll be great. So, I guess have things, in what ways, have some things changed? I just want to say one thing that, I'll answer the question. I want to say one thing that isn't responsive to it, but kind of is tangential to it, but raised by it, that I think a lot about, because, and this must happen to you, so many students come to me and they're trying to figure out, they care about mass incarceration, the criminal justice system, they want to make a difference, and they're wrestling with what to do. And it's not the only two choices aren't be a prosecutor or public defender. There's other policy, there's other ways of getting involved, but those are two of the big ones, and there are two ones where there's a decent number of jobs, so people tend to think about them. And one of the things that your story raises for me that I think a lot about is one of the things that I would find so hard about being a prosecutor is that, when you're in court, like take Brandon's example, or maybe the example of that young man. I'm not sure what the defense lawyer was asking for in that moment. But when you're in court, nobody actually knows like what's going to happen in an individual case if someone is put on probation versus incarcerated, or pretrial if someone is let out on bond versus not, whether someone's given a drug treatment program or not. Right? You can do even an actuarial table where maybe you could do like risk factors and come up with percentages, but nobody knows in the individual case, is it going to be the 60% who succeeds or the 40% that doesn't? Even if you have those numbers, which typically we don't have. The thing that I loved about being a public defender, almost more than anything, was that it was my job within the construct of the legal system to believe in human nature. It was my job to believe and to argue that this client that had failed out of drug treatment programs 2 times before, but really wanted to go home because she needed to take care of her mother and she had a job, that this time, if the judge put her in the treatment program, it would work. And the thing that I find so hard about being the prosecutor is that you didn't know this young man. You had a police report and some other factors, a victim statement, a record. And yet your job was, or is understood to be by many people, to go into court and argue that, Your Honor, if you put her in the program, she's going to relapse again. You don't know. I don't know. But I want to be in the side of believing. So people always talk about a public defender job. It must be so depressing. And I never felt that way. Because it was your job to go to court and believe that people were going to succeed. Okay. Have things changed? I think that I don't know what's changed in the training of lawyers. I do definitely feel like there's a new generation of students, right? The generation coming of age in a low crime era is different from coming of age in the crack year, right? In the crack years. And there's a different public conversation, right? The term nonviolent drug offender just rolls off everybody's tongue now. When you were a prosecutor, I know what you said if I came into court talking about nonviolent drug offending. You said, what's nonviolent about drugs, Your Honor? D.C. had the highest homicide rate in its history last year, and 90% of those homicides were as a result of the drug trade, so Mr. Forman should stop with that nonviolent drug offender. I heard that all the time. So that's different. It's a different context. And so I think that as a result, lawyers that are coming out into the world are coming in with different instincts and different impulses. But here's what I think hasn't changed, and this is what I worry about, and your friend's example of it. When you're a young prosecutor, you don't set the terms of the debate. And you're entering an office that's run by people who came up in, Jill Leovy in her book Ghetto Side calls them the big years. They grew up in the they grew up in the Jeff Sessions years. Like when Jeff Sessions was a U.S. attorney in the 80s and 90s, like my man has not moved an inch in his thinking. And there's a lot of people like that, and they're still running the office. So you come in with your idealism, and so that's why, and I'll end here, I don't know what you think about this. I'd actually love to get your reaction. But when I think about what students should do now, I used to think it was really basically impossible to go into a prosecutor's office and do justice because the culture was going to change you, not vice versa. Now I think a little bit differently because there is this, not that many, but 20, 25 probably around the country, self-identified, more progressive-oriented prosecutors that are looking for people to staff their offices. But here's what I'd say, and I'm curious to get your reaction. I would say if you're considering that, at least go spend 3, 4, 5 years, be formed as a lawyer. Learn what Brady means. Learn what Rosario means. Learn what exculpatory means in the context of a public defender's office. And then if mid-career, 5 or 6 years, if you think, you know what, now I can go and be not necessarily Larry Kramer, not like the chief prosecutor, but now I can enter midway in an office that has a more progressive director, then I actually think maybe you really truly could do some justice. But I don't know, what do you think about that?
I think we will talk about that over dinner.
Okay.
We'll start with Mr. Cabrera, and then I see Carrie and Tammy. So, Mr. Cabrera.
First, just thanks for coming. I'm in the process of reading your book right now. I haven't been able to finish it, and I feel bad about that. I blame Professor Barnes because I'm in his con law class.
Can I just say, I've only been here for an hour and a half, and I've heard a lot of noise about that class. I'm just going to say. I don't know.
Pipe down is what he's saying.
I did catch your interview with Glenn Lowry on his show.
Oh, yeah.
Talking Heads, so I saw that, and I thought that was great. Yesterday, a couple of me and some classmates were having a conversation about kind of the debate about race going on, mostly with liberals right now, and I was characterizing it as a debate between Ta-Nehisi Coates on one side and kind of Mark Lilla on the other. I was wondering if you had any opinions on Ta-Nehisi Coates' new article in The Atlantic that came out last week, and also on Mark Lilla's book, The Once and Future Liberal, and just where you come down on that side of the debate.
I have to confess, so I have not read the Lilla book, and I don't know that I'm well versed enough in the precise terms of that debate to really offer a commentary on it. Can you say, is there maybe a more...
So Mark Lilla basically is arguing against identity politics, and Coates, he never comes out explicitly in favor of identity politics, but he seems to be making the case that we really need to, kind of battle against structural racism. Do you think, as liberals, we should tend more towards the identity politics side, or should we move towards, something more class-based?
Yeah, it's so hard for me. I feel like those arguments at a kind of abstract level are they're sort of hard to engage with it. So, I feel like all politics is identity politics to a certain extent. So it's not. So I guess I would need to to me it would be more need to be presented in like the context of like a particular details. Like on this issue, this person is arguing this person is arguing that. For me to really have something to say about it, I think that, one thing about Coates' work that I find very powerful, but is probably, I end up in a somewhat different position, which is a little bit of a different point than the one, it's a different point than the one you're asking, but I'll comment on it, is, you know, I'm a more optimistic person than he is, I think, about, you know, there's always that tension, and we go back and forth between, you know, we're all optimistic in moments and pessimistic in moments, but I guess when I look at you know, there's so many different ways of looking at the history of this country, and there is a pessimistic interpretation, but when I look at slavery and I look at Jim Crow and I look at where we are now, you know, I don't know anybody who would change places with any prior position, and so I do think that it's slow. It's you know, one step forward, two steps back. You know, it's like that, and there's so much hostility and racism and you know, along the way. But I do think that the fundamental story is a story of slow, halting progress against injustice towards a more just moment and future.
Carrie?
We can continue this at dinner also, but I cut my teeth as a litigator suing Frank Rizzo's police department for police brutality, which was mostly, but not exclusively, against African Americans. And in the Black Lives Matter movement, what's been so poignant for me, this is another version of Mario's question, is the African American police officer, or any minority police officer, doesn't have to be African American, but is particularly poignant. You know, so my question is basically Mario's also, with a slight twist, which is that in looking at police departments over 40 years now, I actually think in some of the cities, the leadership, black, white, or whatever, is a little bit more progressive than the rank and file.
Yeah.
So this is just to ask your thoughts about, you know, we can talk about what to do in different places. I, for some reason, because of my early career suing police departments all the time, I'm just interested in, you know, what can be done there. So we can talk about prosecutors, we can talk about in prisons where I've worked also.
Yeah.
But I just think poignantly of the African American police officer who's also been trained to follow orders or whatever.
Right.
Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, so chapter 3 is about the rise of black police officers, and it's a chapter I would say that I knew the least about going into the research. I just didn't know the history at all. So I didn't know, for example, I mean, I knew, broadly speaking, that there were no black police officers 100 years ago, and then I knew that, you know, by the early 90s, there were black chiefs in many cities, and there were some departments, DC, Atlanta, Detroit, that were majority African American. So I knew that, but I really didn't know much else. So I didn't know, for example, and I write about it here, I didn't know for how long the demand to hire black officers had been a civil rights demand. So Martin Luther King Sr., the father of the Martin Luther King that most of us know, his father was arguing for hiring more black officers in Atlanta in the mid-1940s, and it was a part of a sustained campaign that Atlanta's black elite, especially the sort of the civil rights and religious elite, were fighting. Their slogan was 105, and on page 85 of the book, I have a picture of African American protesters marching outside the Georgia State Capitol with a poster that says 105,000 Negro citizens rate at least one Negro police. There were no black officers in the city at the time, despite the fact that there were 105,000 black citizens, and many of them, you know, quite accomplished. And then a couple years later, they were successful, and Atlanta hires its first 8 black officers. And there's a picture of them on page 87, and there's a massive celebration at Greater Mount Calvary Baptist Church it's overflowing. It's so full that they have to put loudspeakers for people on the street because they're welcoming. The community is welcoming and celebrating the hiring of these 8 black officers, and the degree of optimism about not just what it meant for the men who were being hired, but what it meant for policing in the city is palpable and tragic, given where what we know today. I mean, one of the statistics Paul Butler is likely to give you is that black officers are as likely, and by some studies that he reports more likely, to be responsible for police shootings of black citizens than white officers. And that's, again, part of Paul's point that is this a structure, that it's not individuals. And I see a lot of evidence for that as well. And so where I end up coming down on the question of black police officers is I remain a firm advocate for departments trying to hire more black officers. And that's principally because in most cities still, even with the hiring of black officers, they're underrepresented on the forces. And so I view it as an economic issue and an employment issue. But I don't view it as a way of changing the police force, which makes me sad to say.
Tammy and then Jen.
So I wanted to go back to the idea of being complicit
Yeah.
in how things happen. And I was just reminded that my oldest son got arrested when he was 17. He had a couple of bags of marijuana on him, and because of how the bags were stamped, he was charged with a felony with intent to distribute. And we were able to afford a private attorney. And I remember distinctly, and I'm from Philadelphia, and I know people still revere Rizzo, walking in there. And the way it's pretty much structured everywhere, private attorneys go first, and public defenders come next. And so, that to make a long story short, they reduced the charge. He was right between finishing high school and going to college. He had, after his first semester, he brought his grades back, and his record was expunged. But I remember walking out of that space, and you saw all black men with mamas or girlfriends or both, and I didn't see them. You know what I mean? So they were other. And I just kind of walked out. And it took me years to kind of look back, kind of what you were saying, to realize I did not see any of these people. They were the bad people, and my son was not. And I wonder I'm curious about in your research, the idea of other, as laws were being passed, along with kind of those individuals writing letters saying that is not me, that's an other, and I want you to get rid of the other, and I'm game for that, but not recognizing how everything will roll back in and affect us all in the long run.
Yeah.
Help the good blacks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is, certainly, this notion of kind of respectability politics is an ever-present theme. There's a powerful class dimension to the story. In D.C. and Atlanta especially, there's also a powerful kind of colorism dimension as well. These are cities that have long had established black middle classes, and there's also been a lot of history of discrimination based on skin color within the black community. And so these are real dynamics, that are at play, and that you can see them at play as you're suggesting. I think that, in my view, one of the things that's changed over the past 5-7 years is that more and more African Americans have come to see the criminal system as a racial justice issue, not principally as a crime control issue, and that's probably the biggest change from the years that I'm writing about. So an interesting kind of comparison to this would be the death penalty. So almost had a chapter on the death penalty. One of the hardest things about writing a book, at least for me, is figuring out what you're going to leave out, because you want to include all this stuff. But I was committed to writing a book that was readable, it was accessible, that was under 250 pages, and so it meant stuff that I was desperate to have got cut. And one of the things was a chapter on the death penalty. because the death penalty, in a way, is distinct from other issues in the criminal system in black communities in this respect. Even during times where you can find significant African American support for like mandatory minimums or for the war on drugs, there's always a huge racial gap in support for the death penalty. So even in 1989, 1990, 1991, when crime and violence are at their height and people are trying to throw everything at the problem, you just barely crack majority support for the death penalty in opinion polling for African Americans. There's always basically a 30% gap between white support for the death penalty and black support for the death penalty. And those numbers like goes kind of up and down, but it's basically always this 30 percentage point gap. And I think the reason, and I saw this locally, and this is how I was going to write about it as a chapter, in DC, in the mid-90s, there was a couple of African American police officers, including one of them, a man named Brian Gibson, who was 25 years old, beautiful, had 3 young kids, gave back to the community, volunteered at the Boys and Girls Club, was popular in the neighborhood with kids, was a guy walked up to his cruiser and shot him in the head for no reason that anybody still to this day has understood. And that killing caused people like Marion Barry, who had always been opposed to the death penalty, to support the death penalty and put it on the agenda. And what I saw, because I would read city council transcript after city council transcript, and normally coming in opposition to whatever the punitive drug laws was like the ACLU, the Urban League chapter, and maybe the NAACP chapter. And that was it. And when they put the death penalty on the ballot, all the ministers were there. Howard University was there. Black Lawyers for Justice, groups that just got created for the sake of testifying, were there. There was this massive outpouring of opposition to the death penalty. And everyone got up there and they testified and they talked about the history of lynching. And so in my mind, the explanation for why the death penalty has always been somewhat set apart is that it's always been principally understood in black communities as a racial justice issue, not a crime issue. What I think has changed in the last few years is that the war on drugs is now added to that list. So now and people aren't clear, the war on drugs, once you start to push underneath that, it gets a little hazy. You ask people, do they want to legalize heroin, and the support drops away. But if you use the term war on drugs and you use the term death penalty, you'll see massive African American opposition in a way, at least for the war on drugs, that you didn't see in these years. And so I think that's the piece of the shift. But this othering and this respectability politics that you're describing, my child is different mentality, right? That's the fundamental obstacle that we have to overcome across the board, right? Not just black people, like in this country, right? We have to understand the other is not the other, is one of us. But it's something, as you say, that I think powerfully affects African Americans too. And in my optimistic moments, I would say we're getting a little bit better on that. And I think movies like 13th, movies like 13th, books like The New Jim Crow, books like Just Mercy, Ta-Nehisi Coates's work. I think there's now in the last decade, we've really seen an outpouring of not just academics, but very public, massive bestsellers, widely watched and read movies and books that I think are shifting the narrative somewhat.
I think we're James. Maybe the last question.
So it's a good thing that you just brought up sort of the public stuff we've been seeing over the years, the new Jim Crow from Michelle Alexander, 13, Amy Vernay, and the rest of it. Because all of that material argues at best that white supremacy, writ large, systemic, institutional, and individual, is the reason for all of this. Alexander comes out in her first chapter of her book saying that behind Jim Crow segregation and chattel slavery, mass incarceration stands as a third racial caste system put in place in essence by the bigotry among us, that is us. Your work has always, to my mind, complicated that narrative considerably. I don't know how it's possible to read, say, your racial critiques of the new Jim Crow or this work and not come away with the feeling that when black people had meaningful political power, not on the federal level, not in state legislatures, but in municipalities, that they ran towards the exact same punitive measures against the criminals among us that were popular everywhere else. It's hard for me to explain that through this frame of white supremacy that animates the theory behind movements like Black Lives Matter and certainly with some Ta-Nehisi Coates' work and all the rest. So my question to you, framing it also with the severe class differences that you mentioned before, what are we to do with that complication? Where black people had meaningful political authority, we locked up our own. Shouldn't that put the lie to this framing of just white supremacy, just the people who are not us, as the only people culpable for, I had a chance to go to the jail that I mentioned earlier, and today, so I dressed up, to make sure that they wouldn't keep me there. And as I'm in the space, I'm recognizing that all I'm seeing are white faces. They didn't take us to the wing with all the African American and Asian prisoners. Specifically, they talked about how they separated everyone out, and we just happened to travel through all sorts of other prisoners, but never anyone who looked like me. And there are reasons for that, but I feel as if that's part of the same thinking that is used from some of the people mentioned in the book. It was somehow a problem that the best thing we need to do is sort of shut away us. There's a lot of shutting away us that's even happening in the theory, which is why I'm asking you about it. At what point do we look at this type of material and say, in some respects, mass incarceration is something we did to ourselves?
I guess I've always thought of those explanations, 13th, New Jim Crow, Coates, Brian Stevenson, I'll just sort of put them in a kind of a bucket since they're so publicly articulated and focusing on the question of racism and white supremacy as driving this system that we have now. I've always thought of those as powerfully explanatory but incomplete. And so in my mind, I guess, your question, if anybody says, is it just racism or just white supremacy, then I want to intervene there and say, well, no, it can't be that. And it can't be that for a couple of reasons. One, this. It also can't be that because, they showed you that jail that you're describing, but you can also go to lots of states in this country where, you can go to some states in this country where most of the people in the prisons in that state are white. And the voters, again, remember, this is a state level. So this means that white voters in that state passed laws that led to massive rates of incarceration for the white citizens of that state. And not only are they there in great numbers, but those prisons are quite brutal. So what we know about those people who are incarcerated in those states is that they're poor, overwhelmingly. Many of them come from homes where a parent was addicted to drugs and didn't get the treatment they needed. Many of them have mental health issues and never got treatment for it, and now we're treating them, we're now using the jail as a mental health facility without the treatment part of it. So in my mind, it was never possible that it could just be that. But it's also true, but I've always believed, to circle back to where I started, that it's an important part of the story. Profoundly important. So in my mind, I guess, different sets of actors can reach the same conclusion for different reasons. So it could be true that a white legislator in Louisiana or in my home state of Georgia is more willing to support and was more willing to support tough, long sentences because that legislator understood that in that state, most of the people that were going to go to prison were going to be black. And the relative indifference to black suffering is what causes some of those legislators still today to not want to move away from those choices. It is possible for that to be true, which I take it to be, let's say, the 13th story, and for this to be true about what happened in Washington, D.C. So that's why it's important for me, I guess, to always go back to the point of I'm not rebutting that narrative, but I am building on it, and I am complicating it.
So I think we should, at this point, give a huge round of applause.